Hello and welcome to the GrowCFO Show. My name's Kevin Appleby and today I've got Andrew Waters with me again, and we're talking about how to review the performance of your finance team as you go through to a new year. So Andrew, welcome back to the show.
Good to see you again. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Andrew, and just getting ready for the wind down into Christmas and so on. But I guess that's the whole reason for the conversation. We're at that time of year where we review what our teams are up to, how they've performed this year, and what perhaps might lie ahead for next year. But I think that's a bit different this year, Andrew.
Yeah, it certainly is. It's an unprecedented year for CFOs reviewing their teams because they need to have that more holistic view of the circumstances that each individual faces. So typically going into a Christmas period or New Year period, a CFO or a finance director will be reviewing the team, the structure, who's been the superstars, who do we need to make some changes around in terms of the team and performance. And you're trying to make sure you've got the right people on the bus in terms of the good to great book about having the right people on the bus before you kind of set off on your journey. So that still needs to happen, but you've got individuals that have maybe contracted COVID during the last 12 months, having to homeschool, having to work from home. You've got individuals that are set up very nicely in their house with an office, and you've got individuals that are flat sharing and there's 3 people on a kitchen table working. So you need to know your teams pretty much intimately to know and properly measure how they've performed. And if you've got different layers below you and you've got a financial controller and the financial controller's got a team of 6 or 7 below them, then it's going to take more work this year to review the team performance than previous years.
And there's been a lot of ducking and diving this year. We've taken our existing teams that were very well structured for being in the physical office, and in a lot of cases nobody's been in that physical office, as you say, the difficult working situations, but some people will have adapted to that better than others. And is it fair, given what's gone on this year, Andrew, to necessarily penalize some people because it hasn't quite worked for them?
I think it goes back to what I was alluding to. I think this has definitely been a test of character and people's ability to perhaps be more scrappy and work in an environment where they've got to be more nimble and evolve. Some would have flourished and some would have struggled. Some may have subsequently got up to speed, but it's taken a little bit longer than others. I think when it comes to a review, a lot depends on what you're planning to do long term from an organization standpoint when it comes to remote. Obviously this is likely to be a consideration for at least the first 3 months, maybe 6 months of next year. Is the long-term plan for the organization to now be a remote working organization, or are you going to try and get people into the office full time or as much as possible? And you've got to weigh up for each individual and where you're looking to go, how suitable they are to continue with that transition and what they need to improve. And are there things, in fairness, that the organisation can help them to do to improve? Because it may be that some individuals that are flat sharing and are 4 people in the kitchen working or in a living room working, that they will now be able to come into the office a bit more, or maybe they get a co-working spot closer to home, not in town centre. You've got to look after these key people, because there's a lot of individuals at the moment that if CFOs and organizations expect people to come into the office 5 days a week from June onwards, 2021, unfortunately, these high-flying financial controllers, FP&A directors, or management accountants that have just qualified, they've had a taste of an alternative way of working, which some of them would have flourished and loved, because they're able to do things when they are when they're not commuting, in terms of a yoga class in the morning or playing tennis at lunch. And I think if individuals try to enforce a 5-day working week back in London, you'll lose top talent. They will start looking for roles elsewhere where there's more flexibility. I think the period of time of the remote period of COVID has been too long for it to not be a consideration.
So it sounds to me like that we're getting to the ideal point to review what your structure of your team needs to look like for the longer term. And I guess we came to March, we were locked down, we took the team that was there and made something work. There's always, all the way through the year, been some form of uncertainty. We've been partially back at work. We've been locked down again. We're going into higher and higher tier groups as we approach Christmas. There is some light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccine, though. But we've probably been ducking and diving all the way through the year and making it work with the existing team and making the best of a bad job. So I think what you're telling me, Andrew, is that probably Christmas, going into the new year, it's a good time to draw breath and say, well, what are we really doing long term?
I think so. I think it's essential that a CFO or finance director takes control when there's an opportunity to take control. I don't think there's been an opportunity to take full control in the last 12 months. I think, as you say, it's making the best of a tough circumstance. I think the next 12 months is an opportunity for the CFO to put a stamp on their design of the team and what they want to bring to the organization in terms of their growth strategy or improving the kind of different elements. Every CFO will have a kind of 100-day plan for next year, and obviously the right team in the right places needs to be there to enable them to make that impact. So it's definitely a year to start taking control back of the finance function and what needs to be done moving forwards. And yes, you've got to review what's happened last year. You need to review it like you would previously in terms of output, outcomes, orientated performance reviews. But again, you've got to have a bit more of a considered view of each individual's circumstances. But going forwards, it needs to be set up in a way that those circumstances have been negated and individuals are in a perfect working environment for what can be achieved for the next 12 to 18 months. So what do we do with them in that environment, and how do we make best of that circumstance?
I think one of the key things for me, Andrew, if I was in the position of the CFO or the finance leader at this point, trying to work it out, I would be making sure I was going out of my way to ask each individual member of the team what they wanted. I would be trying not to just assume that I knew what everybody wanted or assume that I knew what worked best.
Definitely. I think individuals, historically are motivated by a few parameters, either title, salary, progression. Individuals in a finance function, in any career function, are complex, but people who used to be super career driven, after the last 12 months, they may have evolved slightly, and it might be more of a balanced kind of growth journey they want to go on. Likewise, individuals where money was the main motivator, it may not be the main motivator now. It might be working every Friday from home so that they can play tennis or have an afternoon off or do a 4-day week. I think you're spot on. You can't assume anything, and you'd rather keep hold of top talent and people that are really strong in your team and that knowledge that they have than start from scratch. You want to keep the best people. When you've got the right team on the bus and you set up on your journey, you can then decide where who sits in which seats. So those superstars, those 9 or 10 out of 10s, and you've got 1 or 2 of those in your team, what are you going to do with them next year to make sure that they're being stretched and that they will stay with you, and maybe they're your succession planning kind of individual? And then what do you do with your 7, 8s out of 10 who do a really good job and are really key to your organization? And how many 6 out of 10s can you carry? And what do you do with your 5 and belows? And those 5 and belows that were last year but were in tricky circumstances, how long do you give them next year? And does that 4 out of 10 performance equate to a 7 out of 10 in normal circumstances? Have you been a CFO in this organization for 3 years, and have you seen that individual operate pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID? So you can make a proper measure of how much they're up for this challenge.
I think for me that I would be concentrating on two groups of people in particular. I'd be saying, first of all, well, those superstars, how do I make sure that I've properly rewarded them? They know that the organization really values them and we're going to look after them going forward. But I'd equally be looking at those people who in the last 9 months have had a significant dip in performance from where I'd expect them to be. And probably recognize, firstly, nobody shows up at work to do a bad job. So what's going on? You've got to dig deep with those individuals to find out what it is. And I think this is probably around where the tough conversation probably isn't necessarily what you want to do for that level of performance. It's more of an understanding conversation and saying, well, hang on, what can we do to help?
I agree. I think, when I've led teams in the past, sometimes you forget going into a year or going into a week that no one comes into the office or working from home deliberately to underperform or to let people down. Quite often it's 100% the opposite. But are they in the right role for their skill set and character? Are they in the right organization for their skill set and character? Are they in the right profession for their skill set and character when it comes to it? So, there's lots of things to, I think it doesn't need to be a hard conversation initially, but clearly in 3 months, 6 months time, if you're having the same issues and you've got very talented individuals that want more and you can structure a team around them, then you've got to start making those decisions, because you've got to have control and know what you're going to expect month in, month out to have that credibility with the board and the investors.
Absolutely. And do you have any particular tips, Andrew? First of all, let's take those high performers. Do you have any particular tips on specifics that perhaps people could be doing in that review of the keeping the high performer on board?
I think you were right. You've got to acknowledge what they've done particularly well this year and to thank them and praise them. And for some people, that is all that they need. And that is enough for them for 6 months or a year. They just want that comfortability that people and your boss is pleased with what you've done, and they've acknowledged that you've gone the extra mile. So I think saying thank you is very underestimated how big an impact that makes. I think one of the things we do with the Future CFO cohort program is we ascertain where the development areas are for an up and coming FD CFO. So a CFO reviewing a superstar below should be having those conversations. What can we do around your development areas, either in the role or external training and development? How can we structure the team slightly differently to enable you to pick up fundraising experience or systems implementation? What can we put on your normal role to add to it that's going to add value to you now and in the long term? So, there's a couple of things. Saying thank you and giving them more, but giving them more in interesting areas that are going to add value and that they want to do.
I absolutely agree with you. And interesting, the GrowCFO Situation Room last week, we had a very interesting discussion around bonuses and whether money actually motivates anybody. And we concluded that actually it doesn't motivate people that much. Lack of money or lack of feeling valued financially definitely demotivates people. But you're paid a fair salary, you've performed well, the bonus isn't necessarily the thing that you perform well to achieve. So there's an awful lot in that saying thank you, giving that interesting extra role to do, giving things that motivate people towards mastery rather than necessarily just financial reward for doing their job well.
I think I agree with you on the whole, but I disagree with you a little bit. And that's probably because I'm in sales, and maybe I've always been motivated by that element. But I think if you don't continually review someone's base salary, they will feel undervalued because the base salaries of individuals are going up, and if they fall below the curve, then you can say thank you as much as you want, but it needs to also be in line with what their role deserves to be paid and what the market rate is for that individual to be paid. So I've definitely had conversations over the years and regularly where they're doing a great job, they're always getting thank yous, they feel appreciated, but they've asked for a salary increase a few times, they've asked for a bonus a few times, and it's not been replicated. And in some ways, when they're approached about roles, or they know that they've got friends with similar background where they're paid 10,000, 20,000 higher base salary, or their bonus is 30%, not 10%, it is a factor. It is a factor.
I think we're actually violently agreeing with each other, Andrew, because what I would say is you've got to pay people enough to take money off the table as an issue. But there are a lot of things then beyond that that you've got to do to make sure folk are properly motivated.
Definitely. And I think the extra benefits element, your pension, gym membership, access to kind of coaches or mental health kind of advice. These are the elements that are, increasingly becoming very, very important, and are kind of negating the need for a bonus-based salary element. I think people are moving in the direction where the money is not the main driver. But I think it's a generational thing, and I think there's still a competitive edge between peers early on in their move up the ranks, where salaries are probably discussed, and it's noticeable what the bandings are for different roles within a growth tech business versus a listed business versus banking.
Yeah, that's raising an interesting point as well, Andrew, that you're talking about gym memberships, mental health assistance and things like that. Now, we've got a lot of people working outside of the office for the first time, and probably a culture that was geared up to people working in the office. So there might be a gym membership thrown into some gym that is local to the office or even in the same building. Mental health coaching can be a much bigger issue now that you've got people working remotely. So that's definitely something that should be redressed this year. Think differently about how you do that.
It's very, I agree. It's very difficult. It depends massively on the size of the organization. If you're a CFO and you've got a financial controller and a head of FP&A and they've got a team of 3 below each, you can really manage their packages and their benefits. And maybe as a CFO, you may have HR in your functional wheelhouse as well. And if it's a small enough growth business, then you can do that. But clearly, if it's a listed business where you get past the banding for your kind of salary banding and here's your benefits and it's top down, then how you manage that team below probably needs to be more subtle. It needs to be, Leanne, you've done an amazing job. I know one of the key things that's really important to you is you want to have Thursday mornings off to take the toddler to nursery and have see your mum or something. So therefore, 3 hours on a Thursday, do that. We're not expecting any output. I think the remote piece is trying to get used to a different zone of communication, so that you're not expecting immediate replies, and you're not. I think people have been out zoomed. There's been too much Zoom, so you've got 5 hours of Zoom in a day, and then you've got to do your day job. So I think I'd say that the remote piece, if it continues, probably needs to evolve a little bit to more just standard phone calls and more time for people to do their jobs without having too many face-to-face Zoom sessions.
And I'd agree with that totally. I think appreciate that people are doing maybe their 7.5 or 8 hours, but they're not necessarily doing it between 9 and 5 as well.
Well, I think there's a lot of people out there that are really struggling to turn the laptop off in the evening, and are starting earlier because they're not commuting. So I don't think it's, for the right individual. The thing is, if you've got the right team that are passionate to deliver, it's never an hours thing, it's an output thing. And the flexibility can be there. Which is why it's all about getting a certain number of 7 and 8s in your team out of 10, and a certain number of 9 and 10s in your team out of 10. And you can carry maybe the odd, depending on your team size, maybe a 6 out of 10. But it's, trying to ascertain who has been underperforming for a significant period and what do we do about it. Do we rehire that position as it is? Do we restructure and absorb the role? Do we tweak the structure and create a new role? And how do we design that role profile, and how do we go to market and do it quickly and efficiently next year?
So there's a lot to think about for the finance leader over Christmas. So yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground there. You can certainly see why reviewing 2020 is going to be difficult, because we're going to be looking at people's performance in unusual circumstances. Some people really will have thrived and we need to reward them. Some people may have drowned a little bit, but that's not necessarily bad performance. So we need to dig deep and work out why. We've got to think about that structure going forward, because expectations have changed. People have discovered that they like working from home. They like having that extra freedom. What's the new normal for your finance team going to look like going into 2021? When we get to June and things are much back to normal from the point of view of what we're allowed to do, does that simply mean we're all back in the office? It doesn't have to be. I think we've learned an awful lot about the way people like to work in the last year. So certainly lots and lots of things to think about there, Andrew.
The last thing to point out is obviously some businesses will have accelerated as a result of what's happened. Tech-enabled businesses would have accelerated significantly, and some wouldn't have. So it's taking into consideration the growth trajectory of your business as well, because that's evolved whilst reviewing the team. So it's not always going to be fit for purpose anymore.
Absolutely. And I can imagine in the tech sector, there might be a few finance teams that are really struggling, simply because of the volume of work that's coming their way. More transactions, bigger growth, need for extra investment, so on, might well be stretching the team to its limits. So this is time to draw breath and say, is this something that's going to continue? An awful lot of people are suggesting that we've moved forward 5 years in the space of a few months in the way some things are done. So are you actually in the right shape for that new tomorrow, given what's happened? And yes, that's as much about maybe increasing your team, restructuring your team with extra people, extra skills, as it is recognizing that the business hasn't done well and you might have to just downsize a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. It's going to be an interesting period of reflection for people.
Andrew, that's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for joining us on the GrowCFO Show this week.
I hope it helped.